I've got something fun for you today, and definitely not filmed last summer. This is a handheld game console that was sold exclusively in China by Starbucks, produced by Subor. Released in May 2025, this thing features 3 Starbucks-themed NES games alongside 9 more filler titles, all of varying levels of legality. And yes, this is an official product. Last time we checked in on Subor, they were a bit of a Famiclone powerhouse in China, whose educational software team appears to have split off and caused an apocalypse of unlicensed DDR games flooding the market. In the present day, however, Subor doesn't really do much of their own product development, instead using their lingering brand recognition to attach their name to cheapo products from other manufacturers, such as this MagSafe-compatible battery bank with a built-in VT369-based Famiclone that can load games over microSD. Oh my god, I want this! I think this lingering brand recognition is also what has enabled them to collaborate with larger brands in China, resulting in some truly baffling licensed products. In 2022, they collaborated with GTMC, the Chinese branch of Toyota, and fast food giant McDonald's, with both receiving themed Famiclone consoles that included a handful of loosely themed game reskins. Toyota got a surprisingly in-depth hack of Adventure Island 2 that serves as a history lesson in celebration of GTMC's 18th anniversary, while McDonald's got more standard reskins of existing games. These consoles were produced in limited quantities, and being Chinese exclusive would be quite difficult to get my hands on. However, this Starbucks collaboration is a bit of a different story. I'm sure you're familiar with Starbucks, you know, burnt coffee, union busting, that Starbucks. At least in the States. With every launch of seasonal merchandise, it's pretty much a given that there will be lines out the door of resellers hoping to resell their cups for hundreds of dollars. And this collector's economy means that there are entire networks in place for international resellers, including from China. So unlike most limited releases, this Subor collaboration was almost disappointingly easy to get my hands on. All I had to do was fork over the money to a reseller with a mildly sketchy Shopify website. I put down my $41.87 on May 26th, honestly half expecting for that to be the end of the story, but thankfully on June 6th, it arrived on my doorstep. This is the so-called Starbucks Nostalgic Subor game console. Originally priced at 198 yuan, or about $28, and released on May 27th, 2025. This console is actually supposed to include a themed Chinese Starbucks gift card worth about $15, which actually makes the deal a bit more appealing, but the reseller has so graciously removed it before sending it out. So there goes my weekend plans. I'm sure the pixel artists in the audience will have nothing but nice things to say about this cover art, but other than that, I think this packaging is nice enough. It just feels so strange to see these two logos next to each other like this though. Inside the box we get the console itself, an instruction manual that's all in Chinese, what appears to be the world's shortest USB charging cable, and a genuine Subor certificate of authenticity. I went for the green colorway, as that's the color that I most associate with Starbucks, but you could also get it in pink, which I honestly think looks a bit better. Regardless of the colorway though, it's a pretty unremarkable looking Subor branded handheld from the front, aside from these pretty ugly pixel art decals that have been applied to the bottom. They'd probably look a bit better if they were UV printed onto the plastic, but these are raised up a bit, and honestly I think it's a pretty tacky look. I understand the coffee cup, but why is the game controller here? The console itself is your pretty standard quote-unquote nostalgic retro handheld fare. It has the rough silhouette of a Game Boy Pocket, with a 2.8-inch display, a D-pad and 4 face buttons labeled ABXY, which we'll touch on later, and start, select, and reset buttons. On the right we have a power switch and volume wheel, the bottom has a 5V USB-C input and headphone output, and on the back we find 2 tiny shoulder buttons as well as 2 identification labels. One of these is yet another Subor certificate of authenticity. Glad I'm not getting a counterfeit Starbucks handheld. The other is a model sticker where we see the Starbucks and Xiaobaowang logos, as well as the actual name for this console, Starbucks OEM Q2. More on that later. Turning the thing on. After that, we're greeted with the main menu. I'm a big fan of the music choice. We have the selection of favorites game, classic game, and setting. The settings let us switch between Chinese and English, the default being the former, adjust the brightness, and reset those 2 settings, I guess. Favorites game appears to be something where you can highlight your own favorite games, and classic game brings us to the actual game selection. Right, so to get these out of the way first, games 4 through 12 are random filler games that have been pulled from Weijing's library. Subor and Weijing have been joined at the hip for decades at this point, with most of Subor's hardware coming with software developed by Weijing, so this isn't too surprising. And by Weijing's library, I mean that these are largely Weijing-developed variants of games from other companies, such as Nice Code Software and Inventor. The games in question are Tank, which is a clone of Battle City by Weijing, Silent Hunter, a reskin of Nice Code's port of Intellivision's Subhunt, Risker, Inventor's hack of Excite Bike, Plush Dog, a variant of Toad in the Hole by Nice Code, Labyrinth, a variant of Nice Code's Burrow Explorer, Hoodle, a hack of Pinball by Inventor, Bolt Action, spelled Bolt Action, a hack of Star Force by Nice Code, Apple Chess by Weijing, and Twinfish by Nice Code. In recent years, we've seen new handhelds coming out with ancient, never-before-seen variants of these generic games, but unfortunately this isn't the case here. The exact version of every game that I just mentioned has already been preserved in some capacity. And yes, every single game on this thing is a standard NES game. Again, more on this later. Of course, I know what you're actually interested in is games 1 through 3, so let's get into those. Game number 1 is Super Barista, which on the surface is clearly a hack of the original Super Mario Bros. More specifically, this is a hack of Inventor's Pandamar hack of SMB1. I'm sure you know the one with the added title screen music and glitchy, repetitive level music. More specifically, this is a hack of the variant of Pandamar from the Arcade Action 2 console, whose included multicart I covered in a prehistoric video that you shouldn't watch. If you ran into Pandamar on a console from the early 2000s, you probably remember this song. However, the Arcade Action 2 replaced it with a rendition of Hello My Baby, and this variant has seemingly become more common in newer Famiclone game sets. And if we really want to be specific, Pandamar itself is a hack of the LB35 hack of SMB1, which is then hacked to— okay, I think you get the point. This version of the game replaces the titular Pandamar with Starbucks' own Barista character, which appears to have been the subject of a whole line of toy bears that seems to have entirely fizzled out in the US. That is, until 5 months after I originally filmed this video, when there was a whole frenzy of people trying to sell glass Barista cups from the 25 holiday season for upwards of $500, only to find that it was an existing glass bear cup design that you could buy online with the Starbucks logo added to it. Isn't consumerism great? I keep getting derailed, sorry. Pandamar's a Barista now, the music note blocks are stars, the mushrooms are cups of coffee, and the coins are coffee beans. Judging by the way they're glowing, I figure that they've been freshly roasted the Starbucks standard of quality. Aside from these few changes, everything else seems to be unchanged from Pandamar. This hack is so surface level that the Toad substitute still calls you Panda when you rescue it. So yes, the headline title on this official Starbucks licensed handheld is a buggy fever dream version of Super Mario Bros. I know that copyright enforcement is way more lax in China, but this is still a surprisingly ballsy move on Subor's part. Even their previous collaborations made sure to use games that weren't quite as blatant and recognizable. Before we move on, I want to touch more on the handheld's controls. Yeah, they suck. The D-pad registers fine in the left, right, and down positions, but the up direction is way stiffer than the rest, doesn't seem to register consistently, and I even managed to get it stuck once. I've actually managed to injure my forearm with an unresponsive D-pad before, so this definitely isn't something that I'm happy to see. So much for all of those Subor quality assurance labels. And you know how I mentioned that the buttons are marked ABXY? Well yeah, they're in the Xbox layout, and unfortunately the labels are correct. A is A and B is B. That is the opposite of what you want for NES games, where the left button should be B and the right button should be A. And the X and Y buttons are just turbo buttons, so with no way to remap the controls, you can't do anything about this. There are also shoulder buttons, but the way they're implemented is even more inexplicable. The R button registers A and B together, while the L button registers X and Y together, so turbo A and B. I can't imagine why you would possibly want them to behave like that. For Super Barista, I found that holding B to run and using R to jump did the job, but I shouldn't have to do that. This thing only plays NES games, it should be configured correctly to play the one thing that it's able to play. On that note, you've probably noticed at this point that the display scaling is also wrong. I couldn't find exactly what the resolution of this display is, but it's definitely not an integer scale for the NES's 256 by 240 resolution. Of course, there are no options to change the display scaling so that it doesn't stretch to fit the screen. So overall, this thing just isn't very good at the one thing it's supposed to do. And get used to that voice sample from before, because you have to listen to it every time you reset the console. That is, until you find out that holding start and select for a couple seconds exits the game without resetting. Glad I found that. Moving on, the next game is Barista Push Coffee Bean, a Sokoban clone. You know, the game where you push boxes around. But this isn't just any Sokoban clone. This is a hack of Nicecode's Box World, which is a clone of a Windows 3.1 shareware game of the same name. However, you're probably more familiar with Box's World. Between the two bears, I think we already know which one has my heart. The Barista sprite doesn't even look much like a bear. From the front it sorta looks like a cat, and from the side it's giving mouse. And either the bear is tiny, or these coffee beans are gigantic. I already talked about this game in day 1 of the 2024 Padvent calendar, but one thing that I'm just now realizing is an issue with this game is that the repeat function on the D-pad is really fast. See, this game lets you undo a single move by pressing A, but it's really easy to accidentally move a coffee bean 2 spots because of how fast the character moves. This leads to a lot of moments where you could just unintentionally get stuck and have to start the stage over. They're tiny levels though, so I'm probably just looking for reasons to complain. The last unique game on the system is Pack Coffee Bean. That title seems a little bit on the nose. This is a hack of Weijing's Audacity snakes, complete with the sad Ka drawing stolen from a Snake Flash game from Miniclip. It's just a snake clone with a few walls. Basically all they've done is change the title, put stars in the background on the title screen, and replace the original pellets with coffee beans. Fun fact, Audacity Snakes is actually an expanded hack of a game from an unknown developer, known as Hungry Worm, which was released on this obscure Technosource TV PlayPower console. And interestingly, this same set of games was found on a random cartridge with 2003 Jungle Tak copyrights, suggesting that this set was originally produced for them but ultimately got canned for some reason. I'm sure this makes no sense to you if you just clicked on this video to hear about the funny Starbucks handheld, so maybe I'll talk about this in a future video. Stay tuned if you're interested. The games from this developer seem pretty haphazardly made, so I'd assume that's why the music slows down when the game starts and then speeds back up when you pause the game. Weijing acquired a few other games from this developer that have similar slowdown issues. And with that, those are the 3 exclusive Starbucks games on this console. Yeah, I know, it's pretty underwhelming. It's just the same junk that's been released in different forms for 2.5 decades at this point. And they have hundreds of these generic games to pick from, so I'm not sure why they just stopped at 12. Were these the best that they had to offer? It's honestly kind of impressive that they're still getting mileage out of this stuff somehow, even as low-powered emulation devices are getting cheaper and cheaper. Yeah, emulation devices. So maybe you haven't caught on, but I've been very careful not to use the word Famiclone when referring to this thing. Remember the model sticker where it's called the Starbucks OEM Q2? Well, there's a regular Subor Q2 as well, and that console supports games from various platforms. It's basically what you'd expect out of those generic game/media players from the early 2010s. So the Subor Q2, and yes, the Starbucks Q2, is in fact an emulation device. The Starbucks version has just been arbitrarily limited to playing NES games. But there is a silver lining here. I neglected to mention it before, but the left side of this console has a slot labeled TF. TF stands for Trans Flash, which... Sorry, what were we talking about again? Trans Flash is the maiden name of microSD, which is still widely used to refer to the standard in China. Popping in a microSD card reveals a new third option on the menu, labeled TF Card Game. So, knowing what we know, we can load this up with games from every platform, right? Well, the manual outlines the process for adding more games, but it specifically mentions creating a folder called NES Game on the root of the SD card. I tried everything I could, but it doesn't look like there's any way to get this thing to run anything except NES games. Honestly, that's really disappointing. Initially, when I saw that this thing came preloaded exclusively with NES games, I was under the false impression that this was one of those VT369 equipped handhelds with an SD card slot, like that power bank that I mentioned earlier. I've been after one of those because those are using an actual NES on a chip, and they're capable of loading normal NES games, sure, but they can also load VT02 and VT03 games. I just think it'd be fun to have a piece of actual hardware that I could load a bunch of bootleg adjacent junk onto. The emulator on this thing seems to be capable of loading anything that an emulator from the pre-FCE-UMM days would be able to run. Don't quote me on this because I'm not an emulation expert in the slightest, but it seems to run most standard games that you can throw at it. If you throw a licensed NES full set in here, it'll probably be able to run most of them just fine. But when we start getting into more obscure stuff, like bootleg games and homebrew with weird mappers, it starts to fall apart. It can't run anything with enhanced hardware, that's just a given. It'll usually just boot you back to the menu if you try to run something weird. Trying to run something like the Pac-Man Championship Edition demake caused a flickery mess of colored lines for some reason. Guess that's a little too new for this thing. But even when I did get games to run, I noticed that it seems to be struggling a little bit. Sometimes the games run a little slow, or they'll speed up, and the audio pretty much constantly has a little bit of crackling going on. Don't tell me that this thing doesn't have enough power to run NES games properly. That's all it can run. I honestly thought that NES emulation was a solved issue. I've been playing emulated NES games for pretty much my entire life in one form or another. Why is this even possible? It plays the best game ever though, so it can't be all bad. Well, it looks like the generic Q2 has all of the included games on a microSD card that comes in the box. The Starbucks Q2 instead opts to have everything stored internally. I had originally intended for this video to end with me expressing interest in sending it out to get dumped, but fortunately, as you can probably tell by the emulator footage, I don't have to do that. A while back, MameHaze got his hands on one of these. And recently, Team Europe was able to dump its internal storage, and the handheld has now been added to MAME, as non-working. I figured that it would be a whole ordeal to extract the games, but BGC member forgot username found that you can just open the bin file like a zip and everything is right there. We can even see that the console indeed only has the NES emulator included, so there really is no way to run anything else. Given how it handles NES though, maybe that's for the best. So that's the Subor X Starbucks handheld. Kind of underwhelming overall, but it was still fun to take a look at. I'm kinda torn between this thing being a cool novelty and e-waste. At least it looks interesting with the rest of my stupid bullshit. I'd like to know, are you interested in more device overviews like this? I'm still trying to figure out what works and what doesn't, so I'd really like to hear your feedback. Whatever I end up doing, I hope I don't get hung up on the script writing process for almost a year. See you next time. By the way, I've been looking for one of my microSD cards for like a year, and it turns out that it was inside this thing the whole time, so I'm glad I dug this project back up. Right, so to get these out of the way first, games for fucking hell, dude.